The concept of eschatological convergence offers a powerful lens through which we can begin to understand and even anticipate certain major geopolitical events that are likely to unfold over the next 2 to 4 years. When you examine the most extreme end times belief systems across different religious traditions, something remarkable becomes apparent. Despite their very different origins and theological frameworks, these eschatologies converge on a surprisingly similar set of desired outcomes. Because powerful actors who hold these beliefs are actively working to bring about these outcomes, we can use the points of convergence to make meaningful predictions about how current conflicts will develop and how the world will transform itself in the near future. This is not speculation for its own sake. It is an analytical method that treats eschatological belief as a real driver of geopolitical decision making, one that conventional realpolitik analysis tends to ignore entirely. The first prediction that follows from this convergence analysis concerns the use of ground troops by the United States. The deployment of ground forces in the Middle East would almost certainly trigger a national military draft, and a national draft would in turn generate enormous domestic political pressure inside America. History has shown repeatedly that a draft forces the question of war into the daily lives of ordinary citizens in a way that remote airstrikes and drone campaigns simply do not. Large numbers of young people would be expected to refuse induction, protest movements would swell, and civil unrest would spread across the country. At a certain threshold of disorder, the federal government would have little choice but to deploy the National Guard domestically, and that deployment would itself accelerate social and political conflict rather than resolve it. The recipe for serious civil strife inside the United States would be complete. What is worth noting here is that this domestic fracturing is not necessarily an unintended consequence from the perspective of those driving the eschatological agenda. Weakening and destabilizing the United States as a coherent political entity may itself be part of what certain actors are hoping to achieve. Connected to the ground troop scenario is another consequence that follows almost inevitably. If the United States commits ground forces and then loses the war, the American military command structure in the Middle East, known as CENTCOM, would in practical terms transfer its effective power and influence over to Israel. The broader regional economy would also be dramatically reshaped. The economies of the Gulf Cooperation Council states are, according to this analysis, being deliberately undermined as part of a larger strategic design. For the Greater Israel Project to be realized in its most expansive form, Israel would need to extend its influence over the GCC, parts of Turkey, and parts of Egypt. Framed differently, the intention as understood through this eschatological lens is to render the Gulf states economically marginal and ultimately irrelevant as independent power centers. Their current wealth, built overwhelmingly on oil exports and recycled through the American financial system, would need to be redirected and their political autonomy neutralized. Turkey and Saudi Arabia are also expected to enter this broadening conflict. Their participation matters not because they would achieve any strategic victory, but because their involvement in the war would serve to weaken the main centers of opposition to the eschatological agendas being pursued. Both countries would suffer tremendously as a result of their participation. At the same time, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, one of the most sacred sites in Islam and a place that sits at the absolute center of competing religious claims over the Holy Land, is expected by proponents of certain Jewish eschatological traditions to be destroyed or at least displaced to make way for the rebuilding of the Third Temple. This event, deeply traumatic for over 1 billion Muslims around the world, would function as both a practical military and political move, and as a powerful symbolic signal that a new eschatological order is being established. Running parallel to these developments is what can be described as the rise of Persia. This requires some explanation. Within certain strands of Jewish and Christian eschatology, the end times scenario involves a vast coalition of nations marching against Israel in a climactic confrontation, often referred to as War of Gog and Magog. Gog, in many contemporary interpretations, is identified as Persia, meaning Iran, alongside Russia. The logic here is counterintuitive but internally consistent. Those pursuing the Greater Israel and Pax Judaica visions do not necessarily need to defeat Iran outright. In fact, Iran winning the current conflict would be acceptable, even desirable from a purely eschatological standpoint, because an Iranian victory would reactivate and amplify Persian civilizational identity, hardening the ideological and geopolitical distinction between the Persian and Jewish worlds. That distinction is precisely what is needed for the prophesied end times coalition to form and march against Israel. In other words, the eschatological script does not require Iran's destruction now. It requires Iran's transformation into the symbolic enemy of the future. This sixth major prediction concerns what would happen inside Israel itself. The Greater Israel Project and what is called Pax Judaica are related but distinct concepts, and conflating them leads to serious misunderstandings. Greater Israel refers specifically to the territorial boundaries that, according to certain interpretations of ancient scripture, were promised by God to the patriarch Abraham and his descendants. This territorial vision encompasses a significantly larger landmass than present-day Israel and includes substantial portions of neighboring countries. Pax Judaica, by contrast, is something far more ambitious, a form of global governance, a one-world governing structure underwritten by advanced artificial intelligence, comprehensive surveillance, infrastructure, and what religious texts describe as the mark of the beast. The war, under this framework, would allow Israel to expand its territory dramatically. Once that territorial consolidation is achieved, capital and technology would begin flowing toward Israel at scale. Major technology companies, the ones that currently dominate the global digital economy, including enterprises involved in semiconductor manufacturing, cloud computing, and artificial intelligence, would gradually reorient themselves toward Israel as the new center of global power. What is now called Silicon Valley might, in this scenario, find its successor in the territory of Judea. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Eurasian continent, Russia would be expected to win its war in Ukraine. But the Russian-Ukrainian conflict should not be understood narrowly as a border dispute or even as a great power competition between Russia and NATO. Through the eschatological lens, this war serves a much larger purpose rooted in Russian Orthodox theology and its specific vision of Moscow as the Third Rome. The idea of the Third Rome holds that after the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the perceived corruption of Western Christianity, Moscow inherited the mantle of true Christian civilization and universal spiritual authority. Realizing that prophecy requires more than military victory in Ukraine. It requires the destruction of the European project and the dissolution of NATO as a functioning alliance. Only by breaking Western Europe as a coherent power bloc can Russia claim its prophesied civilizational destiny. Part of that destiny, within certain Orthodox eschatological streams, involves the restoration of Constantinople, the city now called Istanbul, to Christian and specifically Greek Orthodox control. One scenario involves Greece going to war against Turkey, with Russia providing decisive military support to the Greeks and returning them to their ancient imperial capital. Since Turkey is currently a NATO member, such a development would accelerate exactly the kind of rupture within the Atlantic Alliance that the Third Rome prophecy requires. What makes the eschatological convergence framework so analytically powerful is that it explains things that conventional geopolitical analysis cannot. Purely from a realpolitik perspective, many of the decisions being made in this conflict appear irrational, self-defeating, or disproportionate. Why would the United States risk a prolonged ground war in the Middle East when the strategic and economic costs are so severe? Why would Gulf states participate in a conflict that threatens to destroy the very stability their economies depend upon? Why would Russia expand its war aims in ways that invite maximum Western opposition? Realpolitik offers partial answers at best. Eschatological analysis provides a different kind of coherence. When you understand that the actors involved, or at least significant factions among them, believe they are fulfilling divine prophecy and bringing about the end of history as it has been understood, their behavior starts to make a different kind of sense. They are not optimizing for conventional strategic outcomes. They are trying to trigger a sequence of prophesied events. There is, however, an alternative explanation that deserves serious consideration. It is possible that what looks like eschatological orchestration is in substantial part the result of simple miscalculation. The argument runs roughly as follows. The Trump administration had some success in applying economic and political pressure to Venezuela, and emboldened by that success, it applied similar pressure to Iran, a vastly more capable and differently situated adversary. The strategy failed. Iran did not collapse. It fought back effectively. Now the United States finds itself in a deteriorating situation and is effectively panicking, improvising responses without a coherent end game. If this explanation is correct, the most likely outcome would be that Trump declares some form of victory through diplomatic language and withdraws, leaving the Middle East fundamentally transformed, but not through deliberate design. The problem with this exit scenario is that it runs into a structural wall. War is not a switch that can simply be turned off once it becomes inconvenient. Iran's central strategic advantage over the United States and the Gulf states is geographic and architectural. Iran is essentially a mountain fortress capable of launching rockets and drones into the open desert terrain of the GCC almost indefinitely. American military bases in the region, which were once assumed to provide a reliable deterrent, have proven unable to adequately defend either themselves or the Gulf states from sustained Iranian strikes. Iran also closed the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which the Gulf states export oil to Asian markets, and through which food and consumer goods flow back in return. Without access to the strait, the GCC cannot function economically. Its entire trade and survival architecture depends on that passage remaining open. Now consider what happens if the United States does withdraw. Iran would be in an extraordinarily powerful position. It could demand war reparations from the Gulf states for the destruction of its infrastructure and economy. It could impose tolls and transit taxes on all traffic through the strait. The enormous flows of oil revenue that previously recycled back into the American financial system, sustaining dollar dominance, Wall Street valuations, and the technology investment ecosystem, would now flow to Tehran instead. Over a period of 5 to 10 years, Iran would be positioned to industrialize rapidly, becoming a genuine regional economic superpower. With the United States gone and Iran dominant across the region, Israel and Iran would likely reach a bilateral peace arrangement, one that would not involve Washington and would not serve American interests. The deeper problem for the United States is that withdrawing from the Middle East would not simply mean losing influence abroad. It would accelerate a collapse of the economic model that sustains American prosperity at home. The American economy in its current form is deeply dependent on financial flows from the Gulf, on technology sector investment, and on the continued global centrality of dollar-denominated energy markets. Losing that architecture would trigger a domestic economic crisis serious enough to generate the very revolutionary conditions that sending troops abroad was supposedly meant to prevent. In that sense, the United States may find itself trapped unable to win the war, unable to leave it, facing social and economic breakdown either way. Whether this trap was deliberately set through eschatological planning or stumbled into through arrogance and miscalculation, the outcome is strikingly similar. And that similarity, perhaps more than anything else, is what the law of eschatological convergence is designed to illuminate.